Eva Mossberg is a leader, innovator, and adventuresome expert in the field of sustainable tourism. She is the North America Community Lead and Partner Coordinator for the Adventure Travel Trade Association and the Senior Manager of Strategic Partnerships here at Rise Travel Institute. And Eva will be sharing her presentation titled The Ethics of Travel, Weighing the Pros and Cons of the Tourism Industry. So with that, over to you.
Hello, everybody. First off, I just want to say I'm super inspired by all of the other presentations that I've heard today. So very honored and feel really good about being in the space with you. So I am going to be talking about the ethics of tourism, which was the topic of my capstone. I think we often, this is a topic that's come up, I feel, more and more recently with flight shaming and, all these various organizations bringing up the bad end of tourism. And I'll be examining the history of travel and tourism, and then review sort of the good and the bad, and see how we can actually make it a force for good. For the purposes of this conversation, I'm using tourism as leisure tourism, and travel is more indicative of an act that's less voluntary. So people who move because of displacement due to war and atrocities and emigration and such things. So when I say tourism, it's leisure tourism. So I'm going to start with the evolution of travel and tourism. We have been traveling, for as long as we've been on this planet, according to all the artifacts and proof of, just movement of people since the beginning of time. So archaeological evidence and artifacts. So this is nothing new. And then, so the next step, we traveled, and we still do. Some people still travel for survival, to gather food, to change pastures for animals, and to trade goods. And during the age of discovery that we talked about in the pilot program as well, it's a period during the 15th through the 18th century. People primarily from the European countries also began to travel to grow economically and to expand their political power. So motivated by power and greed is usually not a good thing. They usually don't lead to much good. The age of discovery was plagued by colonialism, and it's a term that National Geographic has defined as control by one power over a dependent area or people. It occurs when one nation subjugates another, conquering its population and exploiting it, often while forcing its own language and cultural values upon people. So we can see how easily this leads to power struggles, right? One people come in and they impose their language and their habits onto the people who live in the destination where they arrive. And, this is still ongoing. I feel like there's often our Western values that are heralded as the best values, whereas they may not at all apply to or fit in with other local cultures, and they often don't. I was going to check the chat here. That was not for me. So back to the colonial times, we had, the empires were built. We had the Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and nations such as Great Britain, France, Holland, Portugal, and Spain. They invaded and imposed their values on ways of life on areas located primarily in Africa and Caribbean. And many of them are still dependent on their colonial history, and they're sort of, what they inherited or what they were imposed on. Much of that is weaved into their local cultures. And even if they're now sovereign, much of that is still in the culture. You can see, for example, with food and language, if you go to the Caribbean, there's some French-speaking areas, even though they're independent countries, they still have that, the heritage from back in the colonial days. During this time also, the white male was established by themselves as superior to other cultures and people. And it's a notion that's still present in many, if not most parts of the world, as I said, where the Western values and the power of the white male is at the center of that circle of power that we also explored, where the white male is in the middle. And then, you can add attributes that belong to you. If you're female, then that puts you a little bit more outside of the circle. And if you are any other color than white, if you have a different religion that doesn't fit in with a white male, then that puts you further and further out of the power. So even though some, in some places we have had, we've had cases where the system has been challenged and overturned. We can talk about the official end of slavery and apartheid, but just because officially it's been abandoned, that doesn't mean that that a change in policy is not enough to change prejudice, social norms, or common practices, as history has shown time and time again. So in the 19th century, with the advent of the luxury ocean-going steamliners, cars and trains, leisure travel became a pastime for the wealthy who crossed Asia on the Orient Express and the Atlantic Ocean on the Titanic and other similar fancy ocean liners. And for anyone who's ever been to Liverpool, England, it's palpable, the massive economic impact that this industry had on that region and others as well. And then later on, of course, commercial flights and charter companies paved the way for people traveling for leisure en masse, as we can see here. It's easy to see that the global environment and modes have changed over time, but the similarities are still there, some of them anyway. People are still motivated to travel for many of the same reasons: leisure, business, warfare, and to escape oppression and unsafe living situations. And the unfair power play established in colonial times is still very much of everyday life. For example, the working conditions of a foreign worker in many instances are still rooted in that seesaw codependent power struggle, which can be said to have begun with colonialism. So now moving forward, I will focus on voluntary travel, so leisure travel. So I will just call it tourism. So now I can go to the next slide. There it is. So the dark side of tourism, at its very worst, it resembles colonialism. The white wealthy man travels to a developing country of non-white ethnicities where he engages in behavior made possible by the inequity of power and money, and that long instilled notion that Western values hold more esteem than non-Western values. The people in the destination hosting the traveler, which we often refer to as the host country or host country, or the host destination, rely on providing services to the traveler for their livelihood, and thereby they cater to their needs, even if it goes against the local customs or depletes local resources. So as a result, indigenous peoples and locals, they often conform to the standards and principle of others, which dilutes their own culture. It is a complicated power struggle, one that has evolved over centuries of time and is made worse by the fact that oftentimes the more the host community caters to the visitor's need, the greater their personal financial gains. So the more they cater to a visitor, even though it means depleting their own culture and resources, the more money they make, which is of course a motivator in some of these developing nations. Two of the most revolting and harrowing examples of this is of course the sex trade and the poaching of exotic animals, where children and animals who really have no voice are used to fulfill the illegal desires of travelers. Foreign owned, and I'm going to move on here to this number 5. Foreign owned investment in regions that have low living standards, so-called developing areas. Again, here we're putting the Western values on and classifying a developing nation. I always ask, developing into what? What is the end goal of a developing nation, and is that good or bad? Anyway, it may appear helpful to a local economy that lacks capital for infrastructure, when in fact it's another example of the wealthy using the resources of developing areas for their own good. So it can be argued, of course, that foreign investment creates opportunities for the local economy, but it also asserts and maintains the notion that the white wealthy man is superior. In addition, although it might seem like a great thing. Oh, I'm building this hotel in this developing nation. Out of every $100 that's spent by a tourist in a developing country, only $5 stay in the local economy. And this act of money leaving the host country and ending up elsewhere, it's called as leakage, economic leakage in tourism. And tourism has also negative consequences on the environment. Global warming caused by carbon emissions, reef bleaching caused by sunscreen products, pollution and disruption of waterways by cruise ships, leading to displacement of marine life, erosion and disturbance of wildlife and their natural habitats by overcrowded parks. The list goes on. Socioeconomic impact of global tourism. So tourism has a tremendous impact. There's no doubt about that on the global environment and also a vast spectrum of stakeholders, from travelers, employees, and business owners to people, animals, local environments, and resources in the host destination. The World Tourism and Travel Council reported in 2019 that almost 1 in 11 jobs globally were in the tourism industry. In the following year, because of COVID and the mobility restrictions, 62 million jobs in the global tourism sector were reported lost. And I think all of us in this room can relate to this, if not personally affected. Definitely, I know in my circle, people who have, well, and myself, lost jobs, new opportunities like Rice Travel Institute, but I don't know anybody who's not been impacted. The pandemic has given us an idea of just how much tourism contributes to the global economy, and also how severely and unevenly it impacts the local communities in every corner of the world, because not every place is affected equally. Tourism makes up between 39 and 69% of the GDP in the Caribbean, but only 8.6% in the US. It's easy to imagine the devastating impacts of limiting tourism in these heavily dependent regions. So to conclude, there is no denying that the tourism industry have both positive and negative impact. Some argue that tourism does more harm than good. However, I do believe that tourism is ripe with opportunity to be a force for good. And this has been quoted many, many times. I still think it holds so true, the whole part of it. I used to just hear the first sentence: travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness. That's all I used to hear. But then the rest of this, I think, holds even more value. Many people need it sorely on these accounts. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one's little corner of the earth in all one's lifetime. It was said so well, and it rings so true in so many ways. But I do believe that travel allows people to learn, to exchange ideas, and to broaden our minds. In addition, as we talked about, economies around the world depend on tourism for survival. Tourism really is a resource and the livelihood of many, in particular in what, again, the Western culture has named developing areas. And there's no lack of information nor misinformation for the curious and concerned. But I do think that there are two challenges that we have, or the one challenge is twofold. It's getting the right information to the right people and getting more people educated in the impacts of their actions. So I'm going to just conclude with some practical recommendations for how to make travel sustainable and a force for good. And this doesn't only apply to when you travel. I apply this to my daily life because I do feel everywhere that we interact with people, we have this responsibility to be mindful and respectful of local people and customs. And again, it can be outside your front door, or it can be halfway around the world. Beware of your own privilege and prejudice. Travel slowly. Immerse yourself deeply in your destination and allow yourself to become a part of the way locals live. Go to the local coffee shop instead of going to where all the tourists go. Support locally owned businesses that employ sustainable practices. I think this is super important here as well. I live in a little seaside town north of Boston on the east coast of the US. and everyone's talking about shopping local, and they all talk the talk, and then they all go and shop at Walmart or one of these big chains where they can get things for cheap and they can get everything in one place. Whereas we have these beautiful, cute little shops that are owned by the people who live here. So support locally owned businesses, photograph with care and intention, consider multiple perspectives as it's an opportunity to learn more about your subjects, and moreover, just learning more about where they came from and a bigger story. Consider animal welfare. Are the animals treated well and performing natural functions that are natural to them? Do they have access to adequate food, water, and shelter? And are you intruding on their natural habitat? Apply the 7 principles of leave no trace. If you aren't familiar with the 7 principles of leave no trace, I recommend you look it up. And then also lastly, participate in a carbon removal and storage program that's offered by Tomorrow's Air. And I put the link in there as well. I'll put it in the chat. And that concludes my stop. Hold on.
Thank you so much, Eva. That was so interesting. A really great way to summarize all of the reasons that we need to be mindful and respectful when we travel, and with a historical perspective, which is my personal favorite.
Well, and I also think we talk about sustainability and DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, as if they're 2 separate issues. They're really not. Sustainability cannot be sustainable without the DEI. Now they're discussed as 2 separate topics, which I think is a mistake.
That's so true. Thank you. Dana has a question. Did you examine the ethical issues raised when people travel to countries with long and ongoing histories of human rights abuses or exploitation of non-human animals? How should these considerations be thought about in terms of tourism?
Let me read that question again. Well, it's interesting because I really think, we can do a lot as individuals, but when you're talking about countries that have long and ongoing histories of human rights abuses and exploitation and of humans and non-humans, I do think, yes, of course, we can vote with our dollars and not go, but I do think the tourism boards of these destinations have a lot of work to do in this area as well. So it's really, one part is educating the consumer, but it's also another part to educate the people who really hold the strings to the economic setup and the tourism industry as a whole in that destination. So I think targeting tourism boards and DMOs, people who promote the destination, there are 2 ends of it.
Thank you. If there are no other questions currently, I'd like to say thank you so much to Eva